evening, everyone. Welcome to Warwick Question Time 2017. There's an awful lot of you here today, isn't it? You're enjoying your first day, those of you that are freshers and just arrived. They're all being very polite at the moment. Let's see if that lasts. So I'd like to thank the Department of Economics for organising tonight's event, and also my own department, Politics and International Studies, for loaning me and also participating in this event tonight. My name's Trevor McCriskin. I'm an associate professor in Politics and International Studies. I do my work on US foreign policy and US domestic politics. So I'm fairly busy at the moment. And I'm going to be doing the kind of David Dimbleby thing tonight, presenting the question time. We have a wonderful panel with us this evening that I'd like you also to welcome. Starting over here on my left, we have Dennis Novy, who's an associate professor in economics here at Warwick, as well as an associate at the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE. Sitting next to him, we have Samira Ahmed, who's a journalist and broadcaster, as well as a visiting professor of journalism at Kingston University. You probably know her best from being the presenter of Newswatch and Front Row on Radio 4. We also have Katie Chakraborty, who is head of advocacy at Oxfam GB. She focuses on Oxfam's political influence within the UK, liaison with the Parliament and trying to advocate for Oxfam's position with Parliament in the UK. We have Kate Williams, who is a historian and broadcaster, professor of modern history at the University of Reading, and her expertise lies in 19th century constitutional history, and you're probably familiar with her for regular contributions on the BBC, CNN, and various other television channels. We also have Faiza Shaheen, who is an economist, a writer, an activist, and an immigrant, as her T-shirt shows. Director of the think tank CLASS, which is the Centre for Labour and Social Studies. And then finally, we have Chris White, who was Conservative MP for Warwick and Leamington from 2010 to 2017, and is vice chair of the think tank Policy Connect, a patron of the international development charity CORD, among various other interests. So that's our panel for this evening. Those of you that are in the audience, many of you have submitted questions for tonight. I think we had nearly 150 questions altogether. Obviously, we're not going to have time to get through all of those. So a panel of very great people from both of our departments, from economics and politics, have selected questions that we will be leading off with this evening. And I believe that the students who asked those questions are sat amongst us here this evening to focus on questions around globalization and anti-globalisation, which is the theme for this evening's question time. The first question is going to be given by a student called Fiona Casperk. Fiona, if you can identify yourself, there we go. Hopefully you've got a microphone. And we're going to ask each of the questions that are asked, we're going to direct to one of our panelists initially, but then hopefully everyone will be able to join in to the discussion on those questions. But Fiona, perhaps you would give our first question, which is going to be directed initially to Katie.
Gladly. So my first question would be, does globalization solely lead to an increase in the divergence between the rich and the poor, or is there a more complex consequence to the global wealth distribution?
Thank you. Great to be here tonight, and great to see so many faces. Well, let's start with a bit of what I think is behind your question, which is an acceptance that the gap between the rich and the poor has reached fairly extreme levels. Oxfam looks at this on an annual basis, looking at the latest wealth and also income in distribution figures. Last year, we reached the shocking conclusion that just 8 men, have the same wealth as half the global population put together, about 3.6 billion people. I was actually in the room in our research department when the figures from Credit Suisse, where we get this, come in, and I have to say we looked at each other and said, I'm not sure we can put this out. I don't think anyone will actually believe us. Maybe we should just sort of change this a little bit, make it something a little bit more palatable. But that's how it breaks down. And what that growth in inequality tends to correspond to is a period from around the early 80s. And in that time, we have, and it's important to say, we have seen huge and significant decreases in poverty. but we've seen the growth of the last 30 years be vastly disproportionate between those at the top and those at the bottom. If you're in the bottom 10%, you've seen your income go up about $3 a year, about the price of a cup of coffee. The top 1% have seen it be about 185 times that much. Now, how much is that to do with globalization? Well, globalization per se is not particularly a bad thing. Being in a globally connected world opens up trade, opens up communication, opens up cultural exchange, opens up many opportunities for many people. But it's the policy environment that goes along with it. So it's the policy environment that says you must completely open up your market to global trade, whether you're ready to or not, and just the few top people in your country benefit from that. It's a policy environment that has gone along with discouraging attempts to build up, for instance, a proper voice for working people in many countries. Lots of crackdown on organised labour, for instance, that sees very different results for workers around the world. So it's that policy environment that's gone along with the globalisation that has probably been a part of that. So the answer, what that means importantly, is the answer is not close off boundaries. The answer is not close down globalization. The answer is not resist progress, resist technology. The answer is to put into place a policy framework that helps that to benefit everybody more equally.
I think we're going to use the words per se quite a lot this evening. Globalization is can be accused of a number of things per se, but I think if we look at in terms of extreme poverty, in the last 50 years, that's fallen from 50% to 10%. But you ended your remarks by saying we need to look at the rules. We need to look at global leadership. We need to look at how international institutions are working together. We need to make sure that areas where you work, international development, and how we as a country maintain our 0.7% GNI into making sure that other people have the opportunities, that other developing countries have the opportunities to reach their full economic potential, as well as using globalization where we're looking at cultural differences, political differences, in terms of technology as well.
You're absolutely right, I think, about the policy environment. And an example of this, I think, which is a very effective example, was the Trafigura scandal of 2006. And the Trafigura is this private oil trading firm based in London, and there was a ship coming from Mexico that had a huge amount of dirty oil in it, lots of waste in it. They didn't want to pay the fees at the Netherlands port to clean up the oil. So they paid another company to clean up the oil. They sent it to a middleman, then another middleman, and it ended up being dumped all over the Côte d'Ivoire, basically in rivers and streams right next to the city, Abidjan. And then it was very difficult to work out who was guilty or not guilty. There was a series of middlemen, and the Ivory Coast refused to prosecute, but some of the actual individuals did. And there you see, I think, why we need this robust policy environment, why we need and it has to be a globalized policy environment, which is what is concerning about leaders. I know we're not going to talk about Donald Trump too much, but leaders like Donald Trump, like Brexit, moving away from the globalized policy environment, because someone as tiny as the Ivory Coast, they are going to find it very difficult to stand up to these huge oil dealing companies, and that goes for all the big globalized companies, whatever they're selling, from sweets to cigarettes to alcohol to burgers, whatever it is. There has to be a way of saying the people need to be protected, and that's workers' rights, but that's also environmental protections. And if we live in a world in which everything's about profit and everything's about profitable gain, because obviously these waste dumpers in the Côte d'Ivoire earned a huge amount of profit, that doesn't work anymore. So we have to think about the wider issue. But these kind of policy environments and policy structures there's a huge amount of courage in doing that, because we have been told for so long that profit is king, and that high profit and being a high GDP is what's going to save us all. And yet, in the example of Trafigura, which I think is the worst of globalization in extremis, unfettered ignoring of of laws and norms. That's what we need to stop. But we need serious global leadership and serious global courage for that, not retreating into our private countries and our private areas. So when you've got Trump saying it's obviously his watchword during the campaign was Americanism, not globalism, that's really worrying, I think, for the future. That's pretty terrifying.
Okay, Samira, and then Faisal wants to come in.
I think I would just start by saying what I think globalization is, which is the idea that jobs can move anywhere, products can come from anywhere, and that we all want to buy something that's... I mean, the idea it goes at is that ultimately we just care about the thing and not the cost, including the ethical cost. And there are two things I would argue that we could do now. And one is, you don't have to wait for a global agreement. You could have individual national governments say, actually, we have rules. So, for example, in the 1980s, there was a company called Rowntree Mackintosh based in York. My brother used to work for them as their manager. And it got taken over by Nestle, a Swiss company. Now, you can't take over Swiss companies because their government doesn't allow it. But the Conservative government of the 1980s allowed a Swiss company to take over a British company. They outsourced a lot of jobs. They've closed down a lot of jobs in Britain. So that kind of thing happens because individual governments choose to let it happen. Cadbury's being taken over by Kraft, which immediately closed down jobs in this country, is another recent example. The other thing you can do is you make your personal choices. How many of you buy clothes from Primark? How many of you think about how much they cost? How many of you throw them away after a few wears? 25% of landfill is now textiles because people are used to buying cheap clothes and throwing them away. I'm not saying everyone has the money to go out and buy expensive clothes, but we forget how much globalization has fed a throwaway culture, and that's a choice that we could choose to step back from.
Isn't fashion the second biggest polluter, I think, in terms of an industry?
And dyeing
I think it
and all
is.
the rest
The dyeing
of it goes into
and
rivers.
the amount of water it takes.
But that's stuff that you could change right now in how you spend your money and whether you keep your clothes.
Okay, Faisal.
Yeah, I think the debate on globalization has become really confused. Of course, as Katie and others have said, there's been some really negative sides of globalization. But I think it's become sort of code for not just movement of goods, but also movement of people. I don't wear this T-shirt because I'm an immigrant. Actually, I'm not an immigrant. But But it's become this hot political issue. So I've spent the last couple of days at the Conservative Party conference where I wore this T-shirt. And the reason I wore it is because constantly you hear that immigration is blamed for certain things. And the way in which the globalization debate has somehow turned is into it's about both goods and jobs and people, that we want to shut down and we want to look inwards more, and we don't want these other things coming in. We don't want this competition. And the thing that's really funny about the whole globalization debate is that the thing that's got the least, so it's not just goods and it's not just people, it's also financial capital. And actually, that is the piece that can move easiest. And that is the piece that has been most damaging in many ways. And yet that gets no time. You know, that's not what Trump's talking about. That's not what we talk about when we have that kind of globalization debate. And so this is a very confused area. And when you look at the issue of inequality, Katie's absolutely right that it's, you know, it's the domestic agenda. When an organization like OECD did the numbers and looked at what it is that's driving inequality, sure, globalization was one of those things, in particular, the movement of goods and capital, money. But the biggest thing was actually that unions have less power, so workers have less power to demand higher wages. So it's become this excuse, and it's extremely complex. And I'm going to stop there, but yeah, you're right in thinking it's much more complex and blame globalization for everything.
Okay, Dennis, do you want to come back to that original question then of sort of global wealth distribution and what is to blame?
It's similar to what Faisal was saying. I would argue that globalization clearly has gone up. I think everyone understands that. Inequality has also gone up, but it depends on how you measure it. So inequality has gone up in individual countries. So inequality has gone up sharply in Britain, sharply in the United States, actually in almost all countries in the world. But if you look at inequality at a global level, inequality has gone down quite sharply. So the question is, where do you draw the border? If you have a truly global understanding, if you care about every person in the world in an equal way, then inequality has gone down. And actually, globalization has played a major role in that. But most politicians do not. I mean, we just talked about what's happening in America, Make America Great Again. Kate made the point that there, the movement is precisely to not think about other people in the world, to just think about your own country. So it depends a bit on how you look at inequality. But overall, I just say that, similar to what Faisal was saying, there are actually lots of reasons why inequality has gone up. If I had to put a number on it as an economist, how much is globalization a reason of that? I'd say probably about 20%. And the remaining 80% is other reasons. For example, technology, changes in IT and so on has benefited the rich and the well-off much more. And most importantly, domestic regulation and domestic policy. This is what we've been talking about quite a lot. Look, there's some few countries where inequality has barely changed. Look at Japan, for example. Japan is a very equal society, and they put a very high value on equality, and that hasn't really changed over the last 30 years, despite massive globalization. But then on the other hand, Japan doesn't do immigration. They have essentially zero immigration. Most people there are expats. So it's a complicated issue, but most of globalization, most of inequality is due to policy choices. And I think this is where we all have to look very seriously again.
And Katie, I know you were involved in a campaign at Oxfam specifically trying to address policy towards inequality. Can you say anything more about sort of the role that you've had in that and the role that Oxfam's played?
Or the sorts of things we've
so
looked at.
the Even It Up campaign I'm thinking of.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we've tried to tackle head on, because I think it is in many ways such an emblem of what Pfizer was talking about, this footloose global finance and the financialization of the global economy that's at the heart of this. So one of the things we've tried to look quite a lot at is the issue of tax havens and tax dodging. You know, $7.6 trillion sits in tax havens worldwide. I mean, if people properly knew who owned that and accounted for it, that would shoot up your inequality ratios as well. You know, for countries that we care about, around $170 billion a year is lost to developing countries. In Africa, that could easily pay for the teachers necessary to get every child into school. So some of these emblematic issues we've been looking at, but I think at the core of it, when you're talking about setting national policy, you keep coming back to labour issues, to trade union issues, to workers' rights, because there just has not been the same emphasis, power, basically. There has not been the same power behind workers to ensure that they're able to get a part of the pie that, to put it crudely, the owners of capital have. And I think that would probably be the thing that's making that biggest difference at the national level.
Okay. Yep.
And I think looking forwards, what the big issue for globalization, the big issue for workers' rights is just as Dennis was bringing up there, is the question of technology and the question of IT and the question of robotics and what that's going to impact. I mean, if you're thinking about 8 men owning half of the global wealth in 10, 20 years' time, when increasing amounts of the jobs from car driving to plane steering to even low-level doctor, medical and lawyers' jobs, is who owns the robots and who owns the AI and who owns the technology. And I think governments are starting to engage with this question of universal income. It was voted on quite recently in Switzerland, but that will create massive inequality between those who have the technology and those who are excluded from it. And if we're going to work with workers' rights, the whole concept is going to completely alter, I think, in future. And I don't think all the politicians are so busy saying to us, we're going to get your jobs back, we're going to get the old jobs are going to come back. It's not a palatable issue, a palatable thing for politicians to be talking about, but they have to.
Funnily enough, I've seen the questions, and I think we might be returning to this issue a little later, but...
I was just going to respond when you say who owns the robots. According to Homo Deus, the robots will be owning us.
We may return to this issue, is all I'm saying, So
no robot politicians, though.
We've obviously, in the discussion so far, it's clear that there are winners and losers in globalization. Our second question is Zara Brown. If Zara could identify herself, there she is. Your question is more about the losers, I believe.
Do you think that the losers of globalization phenomenon is directly related to the rise in alt-right movement in the US and Europe?
So is the losers of globalization phenomenon directly related to the rise in alt-right movements in the US and Europe? And Chris, we were wondering if you could lead us off on this one.
Yes, I think we are going to come back a bit to what we mean by globalization. And I think looking at who are the winners and who are the losers, I'm sure the panel, we've all done our research over this very complex topic. One of the things is, the winners and the losers. The losers are losing less worse because of globalization, perhaps. The winners are making. I think we all agree around the panel that the winners are winning a lot more because of globalization. And I think we've talked about, we can't help, we were told strictly not to talk about Trump.
You can talk about
but
Trump
I think
if you like.
he gets
He
gets a second honorary mention. And I certainly think when he is so clearly opposed to globalization, he's so America first, it does beg the question whether globalization perhaps is an extremely good thing if he thinks it's not. And I think when we are talking about some of the research and the data in terms of what do Western countries think about globalization, well, it's going for a phase of perhaps being less popular. But in the same question being asked in Africa, there's something, what I thought an extraordinary figure, 70% of Africans are in favor of globalization. Is it because there is a shift of seeing and wanting and being part of and employment issues in Africa, or is it seeing and wanting and sharing the issues that are part of the Western world? I think we've mentioned capital and how much that is a clear and absolute driver of what globalization is all about. But if we think of the very beginnings of globalization, where it was issues like religion, which was religion and knowledge, and we're coming back now to looking at the internet and how that is also the most accessible way that we can transfer information. With regards to the alternative or alt-right movements, globalization, I believe, is something that is very difficult to stop. If we think of the protectionist or the isolationist countries, places like North Korea, are they the direction that we want to go? Because that is the extreme of where I could see where the lady's question was going. And I think we should be very conscious of the benefits that globalization has produced, but not forgetting that if it's let run amok, then there will be incredible losers in terms of the disadvantages of globalization, which I think we will be returning to issues like the need for leadership, the need to get reduced trade deficit, the need to reduce trade barriers, those things that can actually benefit what we would suggest were the losers.
Okay, Faiza.
Yeah, so I think sort of broadly the answer to your question is yes, that the losers of globalization and the links between alt-right are there, but it's not as a straight cut. It's kind of gone through this twisted thing that's happened, which is essentially that there are, it's not just the white working class that have been losers of globalization in the world. Of course, there are many people, workers, communities of color that are also working class, and they have also found it difficult in this changing labor market. Now, what has happened is that too often we have seen the media and politicians sort of ramp up this sense of you guys are losing out because these guys are here. And so when you think about why it is that we get this alt-right, or we get this, I mean, we call it alt-right, it's fascism, it's racism, let's call it what it is. And I really do think that is partly sparked by, of course, economic insecurity, but it's also because too often we've appealed to the worst in people, and we've pointed fingers in the wrong places. So, that connection isn't as simple as to say, because of globalization, it's actually a lot of mediating factors in between, factors that we could change and we could stop. Right? So instead of having all these headlines that are extremely immigrant hating, we could have a whole different approach and talk about what's really going on and why it is that these communities and regions and neighborhoods have been stripped of industry rather than what has happened, which is just blame others.
Okay, Dennis.
Right. I would also say that there clearly is a link between losers of globalization and movements like the alt-right, but it's not as easy as one might think. And I think the main issue underlying is a loss of trust of a lot of people in the political system, first and foremost. And partly it is funneled through the media and how the media have this...
Just point at me.
Yeah, sorry, Samira. You're probably not to blame. No, but that there's this fake symmetry. So I mean, as an example, in the context of Brexit, before and after referendum, countless, I remember so many instances where, say, I was on some program and there was somebody else, a pro-Brexit person, and they said one thing that is demonstrably wrong after the other, on the BBC, on other mainstream media outlets. And it just comes across as if there's just two viewpoints. One is whatever, against Brexit, the other one is for Brexit, whatever, and they're all completely equal. They have the same validity. And a lot of people it's just not right. When that happens in the media, there's fake equivalence, and that's an issue. I'm not saying Brexit is always wrong and being against Brexit is always right, but when you get factual things wrong all the time, and some politicians have made a career out of saying one wrong thing after the other.
Who could you mean, possibly?
Like Daniel Hannan, for example.
350 million, wasn't that a fact?
Our foreign secretary arguably just resuscitated the £350 million lie for the NHS. There's an issue, and I think that has contributed to people losing trust in politicians. And I think this is very much the sentiment that the alt-right and other groups like that are exploiting. And we did lots of research, for example, on individuals voting in the Brexit referendum. And it's not just losers of globalization that have voted as kind of a protest move against the government and therefore in favor of Brexit. It is mainly white people. So without white people, clearly there would have been a vast majority to remain in the European Union, as Faisal was saying. And a lot of people who voted for Brexit are fairly well off. They are often fairly rich pensioners. They have big houses. They live in areas where there's almost no immigration, but in those areas, they're the most afraid of immigration. So it's not as clear-cut. And I think we have to be really careful about social media and kind of fake news. And we got to regain trust. People have to regain trust in what politicians say and what the media say.
Samira, I have a feeling you want to come in here.
Well, first of all, Dennis, you need to come on Newswatch soon. So please, and in fact, it's a general plea to all of you. If you see something you don't think is right, please contact Newswatch. It's at Newswatch BBC. Just search for it on the internet. We do desperately need people like you to complain about what's not right so that I can challenge it. It's a real issue. A lot of journalists are concerned. A couple of quick things to point out. What's really interesting about Trump is that he talks one thing, but his daughter got a whole new set of patents for all the products she makes in China that she sells under her name in America. So that kind of hypocrisy is absolutely something that voters at the moment seem to be able to turn a blind eye to. I thought it was very interesting what you said, Dennis, about how there's sometimes a racial component to how people feel about being losers. And when I went to Germany in the late 90s, I worked in Berlin, and I used to spend a lot of time in former East Germany. And what you really noticed was when the wall came down and unification came, a lot of the old, terrible, polluting jobs disappeared. Germany had its own form of kind of mini globalization. And basically all the women went west to looking for work, and all the men stayed behind. And you had whole villages where just men remained. And the whole far-right movement grew. And in a sense, it's like a microcosmic version of what's happened in America and more broadly. And if you look at the German election results, the AfD voting, particularly in former East Germany, where it's been really high, this perceived sense that they're losers. I'm not saying there aren't issues, but I think it's very interesting how there's that sense of victimhood, and that it is to some extent gendered. The other quick thing I wanted to say is that if you think about who are the losers of globalization, this assumption that it's always white people who've lost blue-collar jobs, I would argue we could question how we define loser. All those farmers in India who've lost their livelihoods, those miners and steel workers and factory workers in China who are working in terrible, unsafe conditions to make iPads and all the rest of it, or steel for Western markets. They may be doing it because they feel they're improving their lives, but one could argue they're the real losers, and who's looking out for them? Similarly, the Filipino nannies working in the Middle East suffering domestic abuse, the subcontinental laborers, the United Arab Emirates. Perhaps we need to rethink who are the real victims of globalization and maybe make a bit more of an effort to think about them and not just those in the West who are affluent, relatively speaking.
Okay. Kate?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think there is a sense of perceived victimhood. And yes, of course, there's no denying that blue-collar jobs across the world, particularly in the United States, have declined, in huge amounts, have crumbled. But there was some very fascinating research done on why women didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, why particularly older married women did not necessarily vote for her, and why over history it's often perceived that women will vote in a group together but about things like equality, about things like family planning, but they don't. And what they'd found in America is that so many women, after they marry, throw their lots in behind their husbands because their husbands are the main breadwinner. And so many of these women were saying, well, we didn't vote for Mrs. Clinton because we thought that Donald Trump would better protect my husband's job. And it didn't matter what he said about women. And it didn't matter that women's equality wasn't at the forefront of his agenda. It's because we were protecting our husbands and protecting the family. And I think you see this across the board, that the idea that we must protect the white male breadwinner is sort of very much ingrained in our culture, and whether that's in the attitudes of women, but also in the attitudes of towards Brexit, towards straight across the line, that they have to be protected, and because so heavily, increasingly, you hear lots of men in America, in Britain, across Europe, saying, and in Germany, saying, but I feel I'm at the back of the queue. I feel as if women, as if young people, as if black people, as if people of colour, as if they're getting all the attention, and it should come to me. And there is I think we see a massive shift across institutions, particularly in Britain, about representation of women, about representation of people of colour. People are saying, why are we watching Hollywood films? Why are all the princesses white? Why are we watching Hollywood films when everyone's white? Things are changing, but there is a lot of backlash against that. And so it is much more complicated than, say, Germany in the 1930s, when the horrific poverty imposed on Germany as a consequence of the post-First World War agreements and the reparations that fueled and created and pushed racism and the hard right and pushed the rise of Hitlerism. It is much more complex than that. You have people who, by many standards, are really quite well off, still engaging quite heavily in these movements, which on one hand are alt-right, and on the other hand, as completely as you were saying, they are, let's call it what it is, it's racism.
Casey, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conclusion, we'd all agree. I mean, Zara, my reading is absolutely that this link between the perceived losers of globalization and the alt-right is one of the biggest political sleights of hand that we've seen in this generation. I mean, Samira is absolutely right. This is what winning looks like in a place like Myanmar. It means you work for 7 days a week, 11 hours a day, and you've seen your income go up from $2 a day to $4 a day. Now, that's a massive increase in percentage terms on a graph that shows you winners of globalization in terms of their income going up by 200%. They are winning, but that's what it looks like. It's still, there's no binary distinction between in poverty and out of poverty once you've gone above $1.90 a day. And yet this is working in industries, Zara, H&M, where you have got Ortega of Zara, one of the 8 richest men in the world. That's where the winning is happening, but Trump absolutely personifies this. Don't look at what's going on with me and my friends, look at what's going on there, and that's your problem. And that's where the sleight of hand comes in.
So our next question is going to move us on to thinking about some of the very nice things that we actually get out of globalization. Roger Sinket-Su is in the audience, hopefully. Where is Roger?
Imagine what the world would be today without globalization. Job opportunities, phones, internet, clothing, vehicles, etc. I'm not totally anti-globalization, but I would love to hear what other alternatives we have if we choose to pursue anti-globalizations.
Okay, so we want Dennis, I think, to lead off on this. The world's actually a much better place. We were all taking selfies before this and posting them on our Twitter accounts. It's all so much better for that. What would the world look like without globalization? How could we cope?
Well, I'm a trade economist, so I and colleagues, we think about this every day, and I think on balance, if you take the entire globe together, you come to a very obvious conclusion that globalization, on balance, on average, has been a massive force for good. So say China is a key point, case in point, where we have hundreds of people, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of severe poverty, largely because of actually international trade and access to global markets and the opportunity to export. Now, all of that hasn't come without its problems. That's very obvious too. But the question is, how do we turn around these things and make them work politically for a larger range of people? And that's the real challenge politically. And I don't think there is an alternative, as Chris was saying earlier. I don't think we can stop globalization from happening. This is driven by a lot of technology things, IT, internet, and so on and so on. I don't think we can stop that, but we just have to make it work for more people. And that mainly has to do with domestic issues. So put differently, globalization is something that's happening to countries. No individual country, not even the United States or China, can actually do much about it. It's happening to countries. And countries have to respond mainly with domestic policy answers. And that is the real challenge, I think, for politicians to communicate to the people. And so I wouldn't want to turn back the clock, but I think we have to think completely anew that the world is no longer so much about left versus right. I think it's mainly about closed versus open. And we have to try to convince people that closing in right now, which is what Brexit is about, which is what Trump is about, which is what Marine Le Pen is about, or AfD in Germany. We see this all over the world, in many other countries too. That can't be the answer. We have to cooperate internationally. We have to convince people that this is the way forward in their interest, and that's the challenge.
It's a fascinating question that we can't stop it, isn't it? Because yes, globalization is driven by technology, but it's also driven by, just as Samira was saying a little bit earlier, by the individual consumer and our individual desires. I mean, I don't need the latest iPhone. You don't need to take an upgrade, and yet you do, and yet we buy things. And there is this argument that we are in the West reaching peak stuff. There's no more stuff that many of us can get in our homes. We are buying too much. And the kind of festival of commercialism that maybe is a couple of months around the corner, but mince pies are already in the shops. That these are adding. In a sense, in the West, we've got phones, we've got clothing, with the gentleman, Ortega from Zara being one of the richest men. We've got phones, we've got clothing, but in other parts of the world, they've got the pollution as an outcome of this. There's a lot of war over coltan. It causes a lot of Charles Taylor's, a lot of his power came from the wars over coltan and use of it in various war crimes. How is our desire for things, has that got so high that we actually are creating problems around the world and pollution? If we think that about every fish is swimming around, and inside it is about 20 bits and pieces of plastic, and that's pretty much over the last 20 years. And we're only just, I think, beginning to recognize what we are doing to the environment and doing to the planet, of which we only have one of. And I mean, I can't agree more that we need to keep, and the only way I think we can do to stop this is, of course, taking personal responsibility as consumers, but also, just as Dennis was saying, we can't, things like the European Union did bring in anti-pollution measures. They did bring in measures about trade standards, that the dreaded light bulb question, that we had to have light bulbs that were low energy. Why James Dyson was so anti-Brexit was because they tried to stop him from making his vacuum cleaners excessively powerful, which was unneeded, and therefore huge amounts of electricity supply. That's the kind of laws we need. And sometimes we have to be told as consumers that you can't have massively powerful vacuum cleaners and you can't have ridiculously powerful light bulbs, but you still do have people saying they voted Brexit because of the light bulbs. And we have to think globally about our personal desires, absolutely, but also we can't turn away from each other. The problem is that the current mood we seem to have is in a way of not global collaboration, it's global isolationism, and we've seen in history how that can be a very bad thing.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you. I was just coming back feeling quite guilty and looking on the panel the number of iPhones and iWatches we've got floating about. And I would like to talk about that a little bit more, because I suppose in the end of the day, I don't want to put that guy in China out of a job, or that lady in China out of a job. I would like them to have good terms and conditions and safe working practices and paid good money for those expensive things that we buy. We've also mentioned politicians a lot, and it's the politicians and the legislations and the rules. But I think this is the age of the individual. This is the age of the consumer. This is the age where today we want something, tomorrow there is a mass movement to decide that we don't want something. And I think when the information is out there that the person in China is earning this and doing this for us to have our luxuries, I think there is an argument to saying, how do we get the information out there that this is not what we want to see? This is the outcome of our, for want of a better word, greed, I suppose. We're asked for what would be different solutions. I think we've gone some way with, in terms of responsible capitalism. I don't know how much, legs that particular had, but things like social enterprise and how people look at taking on organizations which have a very different flavor to a traditional business model, and what value that they are creating for the communities that they work or live in, and how we commission those organizations to do, at the end of the day, what is a better thing of working.
Yeah, I mean, we have this conversation about globalization, not globalization, in a really black and white way, and I think it's because we don't often know what other models could look like, and there's not, honestly, I've been doing this stuff for a while, running a think tank, like there's not enough detail of what would be a good trade deal, for instance. What would be a fair trade deal? What would be an equality-producing trade deal? We know what a bad trade deal looks like, but we don't have a strong sense of that, and I think part of that is because we just have really the wrong incentives in the system right now. We talk a lot about sort of profit, and we assume that other things will happen because of that. And Kate mentioned that. And obviously, if you start putting in things like, this has to tick the equality box, this has to make sure that we live within our planetary means, suddenly all of the ways in which we say, for instance, focus on economic growth, goes out the window. This is kind of like sort of fundamental change, like changing the incentives of the system and building a model around that. And it's kind of frustrating to have this conversation as if there's sort of small, sort of sticking plaster things that we can do here and there. That's not where we are in history, and I think this is really about bold reform. And I just want actually disagree on this left versus right doesn't matter, because what does matter is when you're thinking about those things, what sieve you're putting that through, right? Like if you're thinking when we need a new model of globalization, actually the right and left, not in every country, but right now certainly tends to have a different view on what those incentives should be, on, for instance, the extent to which it should be about free markets versus public investment. So it makes a real difference right now, I think, here, what ultimately that model looks like, depending on who's in power.
I mean, it's part of the problem here that we're being very binary in our thinking, because it's left or right, or it's globalization, or it's anti-globalization.
Yeah, it's often
in
a
Roger's
hybrid,
question,
right?
He was talking about not being anti-globalization. It's like, how do you find an alternative that's not all the way one way or all the way the other way? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I suppose I've got two images or two thought experiments that come to mind of what things could look like if we were less globalized or just thought about it differently. The first was I was at the World Economic Forum in Africa earlier this year, the home of people who've benefited from globalization. And a woman came up to me who was in charge of economic development in the state around Durban where this was. And I think she felt safe because she was talking to an NGO, so she started to open up about these really radical things she'd been doing and almost sort of fell into a whisper. I've been trying to look at a policy that would mean that schools in the area had to source their school uniforms from local suppliers. And this was, this was a radical economic transformation. And so one answer is less globalization would look in a place where that was just seen as quite a sensible thing to do, not as breaking every tenet of, well, you've got to look for the cheapest and you've got to, you've got to take advantage of any global supply chain that comes your way. And I suppose the second is a bit of a thought experiment about what it is that's actually globalized. For all the talk of immigration, it isn't people. People move very little, actually, and it's very hard for them to move, and there's many, many reasons why they don't. So imagine a globalization where capital was not allowed to leave the country, but labour was. And then you'd have a very different world where rather than competing to be the easy home of quick capital, you'd compete to be the best country in the world for people and a workforce who would come and be the source of your wealth. So there are quite a few varieties in thinking about what it is that's globalised and what globalisation really is.
I think what everyone's talking about is just, resetting the rules in which you operate. One of the things that I think Pfizer mentioned was, this whole obligation on firms to deliver for their shareholders. That's a priority. So everything's about short-term profit. Asset stripping becomes a completely viable way to do business because you make short-term profits. It does nothing for the long-term endurance of a country's economy or people's welfare. The other thing is this kind of weird literalism. If we stopped thinking in a literal way about things like air miles. I did a conference for the United Nations about fair trade once, and they pointed out that flowers grown somewhere like Kenya or fruit and vegetables grown somewhere like Kenya, flown in on commercial flights that are already coming, they just go in the hold, actually has fewer carbon miles than British-grown vegetables that are trucked from Scotland down to a distribution centre in the southeast and then trucked back out to supermarkets. So sometimes it's just rethinking some of our lazy assumptions.
Okay. So, anyone in the audience want to add anything on this particular question? The reason we've not done that so far is because we've all been talking too much and there's not been time. There are some roving mics, so we've got a man who's very, very furiously waving his arm, wants to ask a follow-on to this question. He's just put his iPhone down, so it'll be okay.
Thank you very much. I'll try and keep it very brief. But one of the things I really want to come in on, and I don't think that's really been touched at all in this current discussion, is pretending that globalization is actually something new. Well, actually, it isn't. If we actually look back at what the greatest stage of globalization was, arguably the 1900s, 1910, all the way up to the First World War. It's called the third stage of globalization, where we again saw mass market integration, we saw all of these things going on, and again, similar results that we've seen today. In fact, I would argue it isn't globalization which is the problem, and in fact, it's a misnomer. Ultimately, it's capitalism. It's a system derived for profit, which, and in fact, the only thing ever happens if it's profit is, the reason which is causing all these growths. Now, that's a completely different question. But just to kind of highlight a few of these points that have come up on the question, that, oh, we all have iPhones anymore, why are people angry? Well, actually, it brings back the phrase, you've never had it so good is the favorite phrase of votes way better. That isn't why people are angry that they can't afford the next iPhone. The fact that to even get a house in Coventry, in quite the not great bits of Coventry, gets a £50,000 deposit. The fact hundreds of people had their home literally burnt down. The fact we've seen the worst decade of wage growth since 1810 is why people are angry.
I think the point is
I would argue.
Want to bring in a...
I'll
no, sorry, can we just... we've got the gist.
Do the panel agree that we are heading to a situation where socialism or barbarism? I'd be very interested. Thank you very much.
About historical... Not sure who's getting the applause, if it's him or me for interrupting. Historical antecedents. Maybe, Kate, you might want to tackle that first.
And obviously in the 19th century, capitalism and globalization, essentially that was the race for empire. What we saw in the 19th century was, by the end of Queen Victoria's reign, Britain ruled over a quarter of the world's population, and very much of that was, yes, of course, it was a battle between other empires such as France and Germany about who had the biggest empire, but a lot of it was creating a supine manufacturing setup, a supine manufacturing load of people who were going to buy British goods. And that was the beginning of this race for profit on which so much of the Victorian city was built. And you have one of the wars in which we rather try and forget we engaged in when we think about British history, which is the Opium War, because essentially China we wanted to buy lots of Chinese tea. They didn't want to buy British goods, so they didn't want to buy cutlery, they didn't want to buy pianos, they didn't want to buy woolly things because they weren't very useful in China. So what happened was you have Britain taking opium that's grown in India and dumping it on China and making them addicted to opium in the attempt to create them as a profitable place for Britain to trade. And when the Chinese authorities tried to fight back, Britain goes in there with the war warships to protect British trade. So you have the beginning in the 19th century is purely a race for empire, and it is not a one that anyone in these countries which are part of the empire, the bigger question of the empire is beneficial still goes on and on, but it's the race for empire did not benefit anyone in China, did not benefit anyone in India. It was something that benefited Britain. And if we are continuing with the globalization, which in its at base has some imperial vision in it, some imperial vision of the white man's mission, the white man being correct, that in itself is, you're absolutely right, is a problem that's almost, is a huge one that has to be reversed and addressed. And yet at the same time, as you say, house prices in this country are insane, inflation is insane. There are young people in particular, who are never going to be able to buy a house anywhere. And so these are two sides of this global problem, in which there are the man from Zara, as you said, the man from Zara, these 8 gentlemen all have huge amounts of money, and everyone else can't make ends meet and are going to food banks in Britain, but are also in different parts of the world, in Myanmar, earning absolutely nothing.
Pfizer.
Yeah, no, I agree that it's essentially that capitalism isn't working, or the model of capitalism that we have right now is not working for the majority. We have a sort of winner-takes-all type system, so whether you look at who owns the technology, whether you look at who owns the debt, the housing, etc., it's no surprise that a lot of people are discontent. You've seen levels of household debt, for instance, go up to pre-financial crisis levels. Ends aren't meeting, something's not working, like you say, with wages. I totally agree, and it's sort of where you funnel that anger and you consider where the problem is. And that's sort of what I've been trying to say, that it's not just globalization, there's a lot of domestic issues, as others have been saying, and it's about policy choice. I mean, on globalization, watching the Real Question Time every week or whatever, the Real Question Time, it's really interesting, because if people talk about a backlash to globalization, but then you hear sort of the Brexiteers, whether they be for the politicians or people on Question Time sometimes, saying essentially, well, now we can look out to the world again, and we can. So it's sort of, obviously there's some kind of globalization and looking out and trade that is seen as a good thing. That's what I mean. The globalization debate is very confused, but what the difference is that we're going to be in charge of that, and this weird harking back to an empire that underlines that. So I think you're right. I mean, globalization's been there for many centuries, and I think it's maybe people want to be more in control potentially, and they think that by writing our own trade deals we'll be more in control. But I think they're incredibly misled on that.
Okay, Samira.
Just a couple of quick observations. I mean, one is, I think the anger is, you're absolutely right. You guys just go out and vote and see if you can make a difference, because there's definitely been a setting of the generations against each other, and the ladder has been pulled up from anyone under 35, as far as I can tell, and that's been a deliberate thing. The other interesting thing, which others have touched on, is I was actually thinking slavery, I guess, was the first example of kind of pure capitalist globalization, wasn't it? People were able, using their superior technology, to go and just enslave others and create a whole economy like the sugar trade on it. And there's this denial, and I think that's the real reason why there's righteous anger now, is that underneath all the posturing about economic policy is a refusal to accept the long-term consequences of that imperial model. And that's why people in America don't want to talk about the Confederate flag and about slavery. And I actually remember the Financial Times, they tweeted an article about what makes a successful company. And they tweeted a picture of the East India Company, which was responsible for the Opium Wars. And I tweeted the editor back and I said, I think you'll find that kind of, slavery and enforced drug addiction backed up by the British government probably helped. And the deputy editor got in touch and said, I might take that one down. But the fact that the FT bothered to put it out as a tweet and carelessly made that kind of casual connection tells you everything about the lack of historical awareness. And I think it's deliberate, that kind of blindsidedness about history. And I think part of what you have to do as a generation whose country it is and whose world it is to challenge those attempts to shut down historical narrative. And that's why the culture wars going on in America right now with the Confederate flag really matter. They're part of the same argument.
And romanticizing that, romanticizing the East India Company, romanticizing the, when you will see antebellum mansions in Louisiana, romanticized these wonderful places of genteel ability. We romanticize the empire quite heavily, and I think empire nostalgia was one of the big drivers of the Brexit vote. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, about the 19th century. I mean, in many ways, globalization was similar in the 19th century. We had lots of trade, we had lots of capital flows. The one big difference is, of course, immigration. Immigration was a lot bigger in the 19th century, anywhere you measure and slice and dice it. That's really changed. Immigration is now arguably the one point where there's very little globalization. I mentioned the case of Japan earlier, which is an extreme case, but even by in Europe, actually, immigration is not as high as it was in the 19th century. And also, I absolutely agree with Kate that the model there in the 19th century was one of exploitation and essentially imperialism, colonialism. I don't think this is where we want to go back to, but the UK in particular, maybe not an accident that Brexit and Trump is where these things have happened in a major way first, at least in the West, is because there is this underlying narrative, oh, we can take back control, we can still do it kind of the way we did in the 19th century, which was explicitly made that argument in the Brexit referendum and still coming up now in politics. So that's, I think we've got to be very careful about that. We don't want to go back there. And about the real wage point, absolutely true. Real wages have flatlined or even gone down the last 10 years, but this is domestic policy choices. This is down to austerity. There's now overwhelming evidence that this is a policy choice. It's a UK policy choice, by the way. Lots of other countries have fared much better. The UK is almost an outlier. In Europe, the UK and Greece are the two outliers, right? Greece is in the euro. That's a completely different reason. The UK is not in the euro. That's a policy choice. And now Brexit is another policy choice that is pushed by some people in the Conservative Party in the most extreme form. I think this is where the dividing line is in politics. There's lots of people in the Conservative Party who have much more in common with people in the Labour Party or in the Lib Dems or other political parties than on the far right of the Conservative Party. But those guys are in charge right now. They're pushing us into a hard Brexit. And that's the real problem for young people in particular. And all issues like housing, for example, is a major issue for young people. That's also where we need a new direction. And it's domestic policy. We can't just blame it on foreigners. We've got to stop doing that.
I just want to say that I was just at an event yesterday, at a fringe event, where they were talking about what to do about housing. And yeah, one of the MPs said, well, you know, most of my constituents would say it's because we have this many immigrants coming every year. And yes, and I think that makes so much sense. And it's so frustrating because it is as simple as that sometimes, that conversation, that it's like, that public, why was it having this conversation about, I went to a specific event on immigration as well. And again, why is it that we need to bring down numbers of immigration? It's because because our public services are suffering because of immigration. It's just like,
it's not the cutbacks, it's not the hospital cutback, the doctor's
it's not austerity.
It's not austerity.
It's not lack of investment in housing for many years.
It was an ideological choice. Absolutely.
The immigrants subsidize.
They use the NHS so very little
the university, public spending, but it's a choice of a government to decide whether they spend the money and how they spend the money, or whether they decide to shrink the state.
It's an ideological choice.
That's the policy choice.
Chris White, former Conservative MP.
Yeah, I'm so missing conference at the moment. I'll make another admission, though, just for you, Dennis, I did not vote for Brexit.
Neither did Theresa May.
Yeah, she's still a member of Parliament. Going back to the Industrial Revolution, I think that's the only way I can sort of recover myself or my party from this.
That's not your fault, Chris.
I think where we find ourselves in Warwick University, we're not far from Birmingham. And I mean, I suppose I'll be watching Victoria with a different light on a Sunday after your comments. And I think we should remember that there were some extraordinary things that happened. I recently read a book called The Lunar Men, which I'm sure you've probably
Jenny
done the
Uglow's
introduction
book, yes.
to. Some of the things which we should be incredibly proud of that happened in Birmingham because of a number of people who were just so advanced in their thinking, they could not stop themselves inventing things, whether they were industrial things or educational things or things that changed our health service forever. And I think it's important to remember that. And going down to the Science Museum, which I did a fortnight ago, to see the Stephenson's rocket there, these changed the face of the Earth. And I think what we perhaps need to be thinking now, apart from those things which we did which were wrong, and I do not dispute any of those things that we did which were wrong, is thinking how we play our place now. What are we going to be doing in terms of what is Great Britain going to be known for? What are we going to be known as for our set of values, where we have been so strong in the past? Things like soft power. A great example, the Olympic Games, how amazing that was seen.
Happy days.
Throughout the world. Things that we can, in terms of our culture, in terms of our music, in terms of the things we can export, in terms of our governance, in terms of international development, the things we do well in the world. I think we can see and beat ourselves up. But what are we going to do in 2015, 2020, 2025? What are we going to do in shaping the next industrial revolution? Because I think we do have a say, and there is one coming. And I'm sure people who understand sort of the fourth industrial revolution, what is that going to impact that is going to have on our lives and our world? These are things we should be looking forward to.
Okay, this brings us quite nicely, actually, onto our next question. So we have, our next question is from Mia Roscoe. Mia, make herself known. And we're going to ask Samira, first of all, I think, to answer this question.
Is it fair for developed countries to impose pollution regulations and restrictions on developing countries such as China?
Is it fair for rich and developed countries to impose restrictions on pollution and things on countries such as China? Is that a summary of the question? Well, I think it's really interesting, the whole issue of regulation, because in the end, you see, like climate change, it doesn't matter who's doing the polluting, ultimately the whole planet's going to be affected. And I actually would give the example of India, because my family originally came from India, my parents' generation, and I've watched what's happened there with industrialization and been really struck by how it's created, I mean, I'm sure you could give me the stats on this, as the economist, it's created a huge middle class of wealth, but the pollution, and just when I go back to India to visit family, it's so prominently destroyed the quality of life for most Indians in cities. And so you could argue that actually imposing what could seem to be Western privilege standards of pollution would benefit people. It's hard in the short term, but ultimately, we're either saying all lives have the same value or we don't. And I know that's controversial, but I'm a great believer in collective responsibility. And I think if we say, well, we've got to allow these countries to grow, and then you look at the consequences, I don't see, and I'm happy to be corrected here, but I think a huge number of people in places like China and India, their quality of lives haven't improved in a meaningful sense. They may, like you say, have doubled the number of dollars. That may buy them something very significant locally. I'm not going to do that down. But I really question how much the quality of civic life has improved. And in that sense, I can see the argument for saying Western countries have a right to be debating the issue. I think what they can't do is set one rule for them and operate by a different one. And I think there is a whole legacy of colonialism, which is why countries like India particularly resent countries like Britain lecturing them about pollution standards, given things like the Opium Wars. But I think we have to have those difficult conversations. And I think if everyone's involved, ultimately, it's the only way forward, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. We all, when we think about global warming, obviously we've seen the world at the forefront of global warming, climate change, this has been increasingly now with hurricanes, with floods, and that's what's been, obviously America has been horrifically hit, but that's often very rare. The majority of the places suffering from extreme climate change are in third world countries, and they are the ones who are on the front line of global warming, and they're the ones who need to be protected. But certainly there is the big problem about the level of consumption we engage in the West, and if that spreads across the world with everyone engaging with as much consumption, as much buying, as much usage of goods, as much from whatever it is, in terms of if we all start, and the argument, if we all start to eat meat in the levels that an American diet consumes meat, that will mean there's no rainforest left, because that's what's growing soy for meat food. So I think we absolutely have to, all of us should be applying to these pollution restrictions, which is obviously heartbreaking since Mr. Trump, I know we're not supposed to talk about him, withdrew from the Paris climate change, but I think all of us have to think, absolutely abide by the same standards, and that's difficult because we all want things and we all want to have these things, and we don't want to imagine that our choices to use, say, plastic bottles, and the plastic bottle, as you say, will end up somewhere in the ditch in India, not being disposed of.
And crucially, I just one thing to add is, I don't think, if you actually, there's a huge environmental movement in countries like China and India, and I think it's really unfair to, and I'm not saying you're implying it, but sometimes people talk as if, we're imposing Western standards on countries which just want to get richer. It is not that, that's just not true. There are so many people who are unhappy about the destruction of their countries by, again, a minority of rich companies. You look at the wealth distribution in a country like India, and you look at the gap between the rural poor. They are not benefiting from this kind of polluting
and
wealth.
even the people in iPhone factories are earning very little comparatively. What's getting the huge amount of money is the shareholders and those who own shares in these huge global companies.
So I teach US politics, so I'm allowed to mention Donald Trump. But of course, he's made it very clear to us the Chinese invented climate change for their own benefit. So I don't know why we're talking about climate change. It doesn't exist, does it? Katie?
I thought Margaret Thatcher was supposed to have invented it to get rid of miners, but anyway, that's a different story. It's a huge injustice. It is, and it's something that organisations like Oxfam really suffer with because of, exactly the reason Kate said. The people that did the least to cause climate change are feeling the effects the worst, and therefore their right, which many leaders, perhaps not environmental movements, many leaders of developing countries see that they have, their right to take a development path, as we did, exploiting their natural resources, is one that the world has to negotiate with them not to do. So the only way around that, our duty as richer countries is to pay them not to develop in that way. And that's where you get this really important area of climate finance, both to help them transition to different technologies, but also, importantly, and this is the bit that gets forgotten, to start to adapt to the change that's already happening. Oxfam's program in Chittagong in South Bangladesh, there's stuff there that you can't do anything about. So part of our programming is teaching women how to swim. I mean, that's one of the most depressing things to think about, that we're at the stage where trying to correct that sort of gender imbalance where women don't learn to swim is our best response to frequent hurricanes and floods. Yeah, they do. Now, there are opportunities, and there are actually opportunities that help with the inequality thing. So if you take a country like Nigeria, its leaders would say, we have every right to exploit our oil reserves to help our country grow. Nigeria is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It's hugely wealthy in terms of, it's comfortably middle income in terms of GDP. 1 in 5 children don't reach their 5th birthday. That oil is not trickling down. There are more opportunities involved in different forms of less extractive forms of energy generation. And there are actually, one of the areas of the 4th industrial revolution or technology I'm more excited about is things like off-grid solar power in countries like Africa, which are inherently more democratic forms of and accessible forms of energy. So it's a massive injustice. It needs to be paid for, and ideally that would be on top of our aid money, because this is like reparation for historical injustices. At the moment it isn't. Ideally it would be. But also there are opportunities as well.
Okay, Dennis.
So a lot of Western countries and Western companies in particular are very keen on pushing pollution standards onto poor countries, developing countries, and they sell it as something for the environment. They say, we just want to cut pollution, but actually what it really is, they just want to shut out the competition. Because by imposing certain standards, of course, standards chosen by Western countries or Western companies, they would drive up the costs of these companies, because these companies in places like India would then have to invest into new filters or whatever might cause the pollution, and to try to deal with that. And that it would drive them out of business. So we got to be very careful whenever a government in the West or companies, often in the background, try to push those standards onto poor countries. So we can't have that kind of thing. We've got to have a more global conversation on this. But I just want to make another point. We often talk about pollution versus growth. We think of this as a dichotomy. There's either pollution or you grow, that's the trade-off. And I think that's something we have to leave behind. Nowadays, the growth is actually in green stuff. The growth is in environmentally friendly industries. The growth is in cars that pollute less. The growth is in alternative energy and so on. And that's how we need to talk about these issues. We have to leave this rhetoric behind that either you pollute or you grow. I mean, and then you grow or the other way around. That's no longer the future.
Okay, Chris, and then
yeah, just very briefly, I think this is when we've talked about the whole issue of globalization. This is one of the most negative implications of globalization. I think we do need global standards, and I think it's important. I certainly agree with Samira on this. Everybody wants the world to improve, and I think there are very strong movements in places like India who are, they are benefiting from whatever growth there is. Places like Brazil benefiting from growth. But I think it is too much for us to expect for our standards to be dropped to these countries without the support of organizations, the NGOs helping those transitions. I think it is too much for us to impose standards without the support and helping people change those policies and be able to do that. The transitions are happening so fast. How can we help with those transitions at the same time?
Yeah, just quickly, I think, because I agree with a lot of what was said, I just think this is one area, again, that we have to think about the broader shift. So you can imagine when we have to think about climate change, which is a global problem, is not something that we can just solve as a country, what that means for how much empathy we have to have for others, how that changes the way in which we see, so movement, people movement because of climate change, what that means in terms of compensation from the West to the rest of the world because they aren't going to grow in the same way as us. And also, fundamentally, what are we going to do? What are we going to do to make sure that our climate footprint is a lot less? How are we going to move to new green technologies? How are we, we talk about the future, how are we going to demonstrate, the best of renewables? Some countries, some low and middle income countries are making the shift from sort of having no clear energy grids straight to renewables. I mean, in some ways, they're doing much better than us. And thinking outside the box on these things. So I just think, this is a key area where we start having to have that kind of collective imagination and collective empathy, and an area where we can't wait for others to do things. We need to be looking at ourselves because, actually one of the biggest things, for instance, in the West that is, and this is controversial, that causes a carbon footprint is people in the West having children. We often look about population growth to other countries and say that they should have less children, but actually our children use up loads more of the environment than other countries.
Don't look at me when you say that.
No. I wasn't looking at you specifically.
Well, there's 10 children, Samira.
Okay, we're going to go back now to the Terminator question from earlier on that we've touched on already. Yasmin Liverpool. I really hope you're from Manchester. That would be really quite funny. But Yasmin Liverpool, your question, which I think is going to be directed to Pfizer.
So the World Economic Forum predicts that by the year 2020, there'll be a net loss of 5 million jobs in 15 major developed and emerging economies. And this is due to the rise of robots. So my question is, what can we do to ensure that the interlinked forces of globalization and automation in particular create more jobs than they displace?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Obviously, it's really fundamental to our futures, how we deal with that, and actually not a lot of thought has gone into it so far. We typically have this thing of technology is going to take loads of jobs away, therefore we should just have a universal basic income and that will solve it because but actually that's just not enough. I think there's a few things that are already playing out. So, look, there are some debates about how many jobs will be lost and where else jobs may be created. We don't know yet. So, you have to take some of those numbers with a pinch of salt, but that's not to say that some jobs aren't going to be automized. It raises many questions because the truth is we can't just assume that this means that we'll just have to have more redistribution and have a whole bunch of people that don't work. Because actually, when you look at the evidence, you look at the well-being evidence in particular, people often like to work. So it kind of causes us to have to think about how people are going to live in communities, give back in a way that they feel is meaningful. So this is coming out a bit convoluted, but I guess the point is that with technology, there's a lot we can do to make sure that that distribution of who wins from technology is not just straight to the 1%. So for instance, if you look at, and there's a real legitimate reason for why we should think more about how we make sure we don't have this winner takes all. So if you take something like Facebook, right? So Mark Zuckerberg, he thought of an extra edition, very smart, but his work drew on a lot of technology that came before that. Many, many people invested that, including the government, right? Including public funding that went into that. Now, is it right that he should gain all of the profits, or him and his shareholders, a small group of people, should gain all of the profits from that? And I would say no, because actually that was a collective effort that brought us to that stage in history where he could do that work. So we have to think about fundamentally changing how that wealth at the top is redistributed. And we have to think about new jobs that come maybe through green technology, maybe in our caring sector. We're an aging population. Currently, we do not value the people that look after our parents, our grandparents, what we do to have a more comfortable life. There's other things that we can do in terms of having a shorter working week. I actually think if people are paid enough, then people would like to have a 3-day weekend, right? Who would argue with that? I tried it for a while and I loved it. And there's another really dangerous thing that happens is that we often go, well, technology, shrug our shoulders, it's technology, so therefore we can't do anything because we don't want to be Luddites and stop technology. You know, with Uber, for instance, it's like, well, it's technology, but actually it's not really about the platform, it's the way in which that's being used to undermine workers' rights. And that's what's so fundamental about this debate right now, is that technology doesn't mean that we have to have more inequality. It doesn't mean that we have to have less workers' rights. We can still insist on those things. It's the way in which we shape that technology. And there are many things we can do to make sure that it doesn't cause a rise of inequality, but we do have to have a stronger hand. We do have to intervene more if we want that to happen.
Okay, Casey.
We need to think about gender differently. We need to think about the role of women in the workplace very differently if we are going to sort of manage some of the impacts from robots. I'll tell you why, for two things. The first is what's projected to happen with the increase of automation in the workplace is that most firms, if they can, will choose to keep people but just pay them less. So the threat of the robots coming in will be what's used to say, well, if you complain, you'll be replaced. If you want for more money, you'll be replaced. It's very unlikely. Look at the amount of capital investment that most firms put in. Most of the money they give to their shareholders, right? It's very actually unlikely that they're going to make this big capital injection into robots, but the threat is very good. And so what you'll get is this sort of hollowing out of the workforce, where you'll get a lot of pressure on very bad, low-paid jobs, which are typically the ones that they can force women to do, and the race to the bottom that firms use, where they use sort of gender politics essentially to pay off workers against each other and have the race to bottom, that will come through. But where jobs are replaced, and it's typically going to be more highly skilled jobs where the people are more expensive, so it is a better cost benefit to get in, pay that initial upfront cost for the automation and the robots and the AI or whatever. They're more likely to be male jobs. And where are they going to go? Pfizer's absolutely right. We have declining jobs, and yet we have a huge need for jobs in care and in other social and in jobs that take more emotional intelligence, where humanity is at the basis of the job. And yet they are low-valued, underpaid, again, female jobs. So we need to develop a sense where there is kudos and status and where you can support a family by working in care. So gender, actually, in this Terminator question, is at the heart of so much of it.
Okay. So highly paid, highly skilled, male jobs, robotic economic professors in the future, perhaps? Dennis?
I hope not. But now, I mean, Yasmin mentioned the study. I haven't seen the study, but it's not the first time that a loss of jobs or net loss of jobs has been predicted. Actually, if you look at the rise of robots historically, they have created many more jobs than they have destroyed. So there's been a net gain coming from robots. Now, that might not be true in the future. Perhaps this is going to change in the future. But the answer to that, I think, is essentially, you can make it into one simple policy. It's technology versus education. It's a race. So robots represent the rise of technology. I don't think you can change that. Countries can fiddle with it in the short term, try to impose a robot tax or whatever, do sorts of things about it. But that's not going to work out in the long run because those robots are just going to be put in some other place. So what you have to do is you have to train up the workforce, because a lot of people think about the economy as, okay, there's 1 million jobs, and if a robot comes in and takes over a job, that's one job lost for a human. This is not how the economy works. The types of jobs change all the time. People get more educated over time, and they take on new jobs that previously didn't even exist. New industries arise all the time. That's how we should think about the economy. And it's down, again, to domestic policy to invest in education and make sure that people can race away from the robots. People have to upgrade. You know, if the technology upgrades and robots become better and better and more, well, you have to upgrade the people. And that means education. That's kind of a debate that Britain needs to have desperately. And I'm very happy that obviously lots of people here entering university right now, you're doing the right thing, but lots of other people do not have the chance to go to university, and they will be the ones that suffer from this. So it's, again, down to domestic policy and making sure we make the right choices.
Okay, all I can think of is Cybermen and Doctor Who and humans being upgraded. Chris, you mentioned earlier, you sort of brought up the robots will take over. I mean, that's less to do with robotics, more to do with sort of autonomous technology, autonomous, artificial intelligence.
I mean, the issue of Facebook has been brought up, and I think how, certainly I mentioned the book Homo Deus at the very beginning, and how you only have so many likes, and Facebook knows you more than your work colleagues. 100 likes know you more than your friends. 300 likes, it knows you more than you know yourself. And with that level of data that people be extracting from, it does make it extremely difficult. I do agree very much with what Dennis is saying, that it's about education. It's about being the step ahead and about using robots for what robots perhaps should be used for. And I worked for an automotive company, and going into seeing where they were painting bumpers and seeing people with visors on, with fresh air being forced over their face, where they're spraying the same dance day in, day out, same bumper, the same micro thickness of paint. And I was there when that changed to be a robotic system. And I must think that that is a good thing. The people who were spraying those bumpers were given other jobs within the firm, whether it was quality assurance or whatever. But it wasn't a question of losing those jobs and replacing them with super fit, never be repaired, never be maintained robots. There was a whole different way of working, which I think the word Luddites was mentioned. And I do think there's, and not least over the road at WMG, a lot of these things are being thought out of that will be happening in 5 or 10 years.
I just wanted to offer up a scenario. I went to the Ozarks 2 weeks ago, just for the weekend, to the house of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the Little House on the Prairie books. And what was amazing was, because it's a big Amish area, and you see the Amish riding their buggies down the freeways, and the Mennonites, who are another fundamentalist Christian community, they come to the farmhouse. And what I really picked up was a sense of, not that everyone should necessarily adopt a way of life that refuses modern technology, but there's something to be learnt from communities that have held on to values that predate the kind of obsession with the new, making money. And I basically came back really humbled as this Londoner who lives a fast life. And I met people whose values were about more than how much money they earned and what their status was job-wise. And I think back to local models like Bourneville, founded by Quakers, the family behind Cadbury, who built communities of workers where the quality of their life, the houses that they lived in, was all part of the vision of their owners. And I'm not saying we have to turn the clock back in that literal sense, but there's something about the philosophy of great work The idea of something being handmade because you want to make it good. And believe me, I'm not a kind of huge advocate for the slow movement or anything. I just think sometimes reflecting on communities which have held on to traditional values might teach us something about how we choose to adapt to the future and things like robotics.
Okay, we've got one more selected student question in the audience that actually carries on quite nicely, I think, from this, and is going to be directed to Kate. And so AJ Umesh Pei should be with our final question.
All right, my question is this wave of anti-globalization unique, or does it have a history? And more importantly, is this phase a transitory phase, or is it going to have long-lasting impact? That's my question.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical roots of globalization, but this is the anti-globalization movement. Is that also something that has its historical predecessors?
Yes, absolutely. So we've talked quite a lot about the precedents for globalization, about the Victorian chase after empire, and really the chase after empire in Britain that began in the reign of Elizabeth I, when her pirates went buccaneering all over the world, collecting together an empire which transmuted into slavery, which became the British Empire. And you do see a lot of anti-globalization protests throughout history. You saw a huge swathe of anti-slavery protests, particularly in Britain, a lot of women in particular, very linked to the sentimental culture. But what I think also historically is very linked to globalization in history, and is a question that we all should consider as well, is how interlinked and intermarried globalization is with war, how much of the British Empire in British history we have gone to war to protect our global interests. But I mean, the most of all, with the First World War, it was essentially an inevitable clash of empires between Germany and Britain, because they were both trying to get the biggest empire. And you see this throughout history about the clash of empires and protecting our interests. And that is, I think, one of the questions we have to consider going forwards, is how much does globalization engage us and engages. We know that, of course, war is a horrifically profitable industry, whether it's arms sales, and industrial collation, or the slavery that's created as a consequence of war and making goods for the home country. But there are very many anti-globalization protests throughout history. But I think that it's strongest at the moment, basically because very much, of course, thanks to the internet, thanks to global communication, we have a better assessment now about what our own personal capitalist economic choices, what our own personal desires, what impact they have on the rest of the world. And that is growing. So I think our information is the best it has ever been. And obviously, just as Dennis was saying, education is what we have to work on, but our information is the best. So the globalization movement is very much based on people's own assessments. And that is what is different. And I think the anti-globalization movement is growing, and as a consequence of the information. But just as Faisal was saying, a lot of the reaction to globalization is also itself globalization. So with Brexit, a lot of the anti-EU people were saying, let's take back control, just as you were saying, and let's go out. So people, the very hard Brexit right in the Conservative Party are saying, we want to go out and have this high-level buccaneering Britain we want to be a tax haven with no taxes and just go out there and do whatever we want to these crazy trade ingredients, bring in the chlorinated chicken, the whole lot of it. And that is itself extreme globalization. So actually a lot of anti-globalization movements which are actually more globalized. So I think we need to engage absolutely intrinsically with what we are protesting against, and the fact is that, and what our politicians are telling us, and what movements we're getting involved in. Because yes, I think we are in the greatest anti-globalization movement we have ever seen, but because, unlike the anti-slavery movement, it is so embroiled in our lives, embroiled in our personal choices. In the anti-slavery movement, it could be made very clear that we need to ban slavery. It's much more difficult to say, what is globalization? Is it iPhones? Let's all ban iPhones. It's not that simple, which is what I think we've all been talking about, how complex it is. So yes, it's the biggest movement, but where it goes, in terms of the next industrial revolution, in terms of the possibility there is for war, with going to war over water is one of our most contested resources. And to a degree, people say that there might be an argument that children are one of our most contested resources in the future, with the birth rates in developed Western countries dropping. So what is going to happen in the future? I think we all need to make personal choices to avoid the war that could possibly come.
Okay, we're getting very short on time, but I know others want to come in on this.
Well,
So,
just
Samira.
briefly, it seems to me that if you're talking about why is there this, I mean, in a sense, your question about anti-globalisation is about why is there so much anger? And I think a lot of the blame can go to politicians. There's been a real recklessness about the way politicians across the world have played with ideas about nationalism. And I think I do see parallels with the 1930s, which was also, of course, partly a political response to an economic crisis. And if you remember, 2008 is that point from which we started to see all these movements grow. And I think if there's one thing I'd say is it's shocking how short-term the memories of both politicians and many journalists have been and how stuff is reported. And you look at, I mean, for example, you look at what's been happening in Spain and Catalonia this weekend. I can't believe that's going on the streets of an EU member state, and the violence that we've seen and the responses from both governments, which just leads to more violence. That's the picture. That's becoming normalised, and I think we all need to make a stand, and we need to challenge our politicians and our news coverage to actually be more responsible about how we deal with these issues around nationalism, which are at the heart of anti-globalisation protests.
Okay, Liza.
Yeah, I mean, what an incredible time to be studying economics or politics or history. I mean, it's an incredible time to be looking at these things. Like when I was studying these things, it was sort of like that boring Blair Brown era, and nothing was really happening. But what's really interesting. It's interesting time to be alive, although worrying, of course. And there's this real sense of, I do like loads of sort of news punditry now, and there's this real sense of like, as if these things have come from nowhere. And actually, in many ways, like Samira said, there's a real, harks back to other eras. There's a real sense that Trump was going to happen, Brexit was going to happen, these things were going to happen, because ultimately the levels of inequality that we have, the type of inequality we have, where we have the top 1% not just owning wealth, but so often having the power, not just in terms of our banks or our politics, but also in who writes our scripts. My husband's an actor, and it's just so clear who writes these scripts and who they write it for and the way they write it. Like from all across the board, this tiny group of people, and so we've returned to this battle of the people versus a tiny elite trying to hold on to power and their wealth and protect the status quo. And for me personally, I just don't see how they can continue to protect the status quo. I think people are waking up. Unfortunately, too often that people are waking up and blaming immigrants instead. But I think that is starting to shift. People are realizing, and as Brexit plays through, people are going to realize that not having immigration is not going to solve all those problems. It's not going to suddenly give them the security that they want in life. So I think we are at a turning point on a lot of these issues, and people are going to starting to demand more, which is a good thing.
I've seen bands play on this stage where they threaten to pull the power if you go over time, but I think we might go over time a little bit, so I apologise. Katie.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I think there's always been anti-globalisation protests. I mean, in this wave of modern hyper-globalisation that we've been talking about rather than empire and slavery, but it's had a kind of global justice mindset. It's been the protesters at Montreal, and it's been aligned to an anti-capitalism thing. What you're seeing now is something a lot more visceral, isn't it? It's a lot more personal. It's saying, well, what about me? Am I surplus to requirements in this modern world? I exist. I may not be in London, I may not be or I may not even be in the rich world, but I exist. I have a family, I have a livelihood, and where do I fit in? Which is why, obviously, the unit of organisation that fits everyone in is the nationalist state unit. And so that's, of course, the one that's seeing the resurgence. If you're, to paraphrase Theresa May, if you're not that person who's lucky enough to be a citizen of anywhere, then your citizenship really matters, which is why it's become so easy for essentially those economic concerns to become anti-immigrant or quite nationalist concerns. And I think for me that's why it's so vital that we do not lose a faith in the global institutions that have been set up to manage nation states. And, you know, Theresa May's had a bad time this week, and she hasn't had a great time on this panel, but I say one thing for her. Her speech at the UN last week was spot on, and I think coming particularly after Donald Trump and making that case for the continued importance of a rules-based international order, I think is vital, and we're going to need it now more than ever.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, to finish with a rules-based international order is probably the most global thing anybody could possibly say on this this panel. I think what we've said tonight is that globalization is there's an inevitability about globalization, not least because as consumers, what we want to consume. It has changed the face of the planet from, as we talked about, the transfer of religions across the world to what we have now, products being manufactured anywhere to be sold anywhere. With regards to anti-globalization, though, I think anti-globalization is probably are discrete elements to globalization. We talk about gender equality, talking about climate change. These are issues that could be linked to globalization, but issues in their own right can be changed through movement and dialogue, using the UN, using the other resources. Globalization, in my view, has done many good things, but there is so much change that needs to happen to make sure that we continue to get it right, because the alternatives are unimaginable.
So for the last word, we're going to go to Dennis, who is saying, no, I don't need to, but I'm going to make him do it anyway. Because this is the second year running that he's done this. He survived the Brexit discussion last year and came back for more. So Dennis, last thoughts on globalization and anti-globalization.
Last year we had somebody from UKIP here, and that was quite interesting. Now, I mean, lots of people probably in the audience are probably too young to remember this, but in, say, 10 years, 15 years ago, 2005, 6 or so, a lot of these issues we've been debating tonight were not really an issue. I mean, people didn't really talk about trade or immigration that much. It really was triggered by the global financial crisis, where something that happened in the mortgage subprime market in the US very rapidly spread throughout the world and caused a massive recession in most countries, actually, in the world. So I'm sure that the criticism is going to subside again at some point. People are going to focus on other issues again. But a lot of anti-globalization movement is actually probably not the right term. It's not anti-globalization. I think people are looking out for more responsible globalization. It's not that people say we just want none of it anymore. I think most of them say we still are okay with it somehow, but we want it in a more responsible and a more moderate way. And that's the challenge for politicians.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run over. They didn't pull the plug on us, so that's good. But thank you so much for being here for this, which I hope you agree was a very engaging evening. And you already have shown your appreciation for Dennis, Samira, Katie, Kate, Faiza, and Chris. Thank you all for coming along this evening. Apparently, the bars are open, so please do go and do what students do, and lectures have begun, so make sure that you wake up in the morning. Thank you very much.